So I've talked enough about the election as it pertains to the politics. Now I want to kind of unpack some layers that's a little deeper than the surface. This particular section I'm going to call the psychology of white supremacy. So a lot of the conversations that we had center around the political spectrum because that's the time that we in. So a lot of stuff come out. It's a couple of things that I want to talk about as it pertains to that underbelly of America that I mentioned on episode 8, where I talk about, a lot of those racist values or white supremacist values still hold true. It's a couple of things I want to talk about. One, most people don't know about the history of eugenics in America. And for those of you who are unexposed to that, I encourage you to Google search and look into what eugenics is, what the eugenicist movement was, and how it played into some of the things we experience present day. The eugenics movement was simply the science of racism. It was a pseudoscience, to be specific, a pseudoscience centered around proving that the Aryan or white race was superior to every other race of people in existence. And they created all of this pseudo-scientific rhetoric to help perpetuate that idea that we know to be false. So let me share perspective several different ways. I'll start with saying, I set out on a quest to understand what would make someone, because we know for the most part, racism is a learned behavior. It's not something that, if you bring, my mentor always liked to use the analogy or the metaphor. He said, if you take 22 2-year-olds of all different backgrounds and put them in a room with toys, the only thing that they're going to care about is playing with toys and having fun. They're not going to care about what your race is, beliefs, who your parents are, any of that. And there is a lot of merit to be had with that perspective. However, I want to unpack something that's a little bit deeper than the surface. My goal was to understand what would make somebody want to be racist. As a human being, I've lived my life as a human being, and although I want to be happy, although I want to build success for me and my family, I've never in my lifetime wanted that happiness and success to come at the expense of anyone else. So in an effort to be more understanding of how, and again, everybody don't really have the bandwidth, and I understand. If you like, F that, I don't care. I'm not taking no time to understand why they want to be the way they be. I understand that completely. I don't judge you or fault you for that perspective. But me being the person that I am, I really began to take inventory and say, I want to know why. And I came to this conclusion. And this is what I call the psychology of racism. Racism is largely a function of survival for European people, for people of European descent, or what we know as white people. What do I mean by that? Well, on a genetic and anatomical level, when your gene pool is recessive, that means you can only reproduce yourself with yourself in a pure form, right? So white people can only produce more white people by being with white people. If they don't do that on a genetic level, if they don't mate in that way, if they don't pair and share ideology in that way, then natural selection will ultimately win in as it pertains to a social construct of race. Keep in mind, the idea of race is 100% a human construct. It's a man-made construct. Whether you go back to antiquity when they referred to black people as Moors or whatever, it's so many different representations that we have to prove, and it's enough information where we know and can prove race is a construct of man, of human beings. With that being said, if the survival of your race was predicated upon the ability for you to reproduce more of your race with yourself, if you could only reproduce more of your race with yourself, and you become hell-bent on producing more of your race for fear of, quote unquote, some extinction, then the natural order, the natural course for you to take is to be racist, to consolidate your worldview to just you and your race. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, when you have a dominant gene pool, I can replicate and reproduce myself with anybody. The Eve gene, the mitochondrial DNA, is present in the black woman or the indigenous woman or the African woman. However, it's so many titles centered around it. I don't want to get into the song and dance of that conversation. I just want to speak to what we know. The Eve gene, the mitochondrial DNA of every human in existence, of every character trait in existence, is present, and that's what they call the Eve gene, is present in the black woman. Every feature, blue eyes, blonde hair, whatever you want to name, every feature that exists is present in the mitochondria of the black woman, and it is known as the Eve gene. It serves us no purpose at all to marginalize ourselves in any capacity based on the idea of race. Because genetically, we will always be able to produce ourselves. So now when you understand racism on that level, this is not an excuse. By no means do I want what I'm saying here to be misinterpreted or misconstrued as an excuse. But foundationally, now you see when you insert ignorance, when you insert fear into the very ideology that I just spoke on about genetic recession versus genetic dominance, right? Add fear, add ignorance, add anxiety, add all of those things that we see exist today. And what you create is an ideology of racism that says, for fear of extinction, I have to make every other race feel inferior to me so that they can aspire and espouse to my beliefs, in my systems of governance, in my rule of law, in my positions, in my perspectives. And so now, when you look at it through that lens, the greatest trick that has been played on human existence is that somehow proximity to European values or Eurocentric values or Eurocentric viewpoints is the right way to be. That proximity to whiteness is what so many of us of all races of people chase, largely because of the propaganda that was created during the eugenicist movement and during the movement of eugenics and this pseudoscience of racial superiority. And guess who built the premise for their entire campaign off of the eugenicist movement and off of eugenics? Hitler. Hitler followed the eugenicist manifesto to the T. This Aryan ideology of superiority, all of that foundationally and fundamentally is the principles of the eugenicist movement. The history is so deep. I'm sure all of us or most of us are familiar with Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus. If you ever take some time, look at the history of the Ringling Brothers Circus. The history of the circus is founded in human zoos. They would kidnap people from places in Africa and all around the world. It's not just exclusive to Africa, but a lot of it was the displacement of indigenous people from their lands. Put them in captivity and had them on display in human zoos. And that was truly your first circus, per se. Ada Benga. Look up Ada Benga. Ada Benga was a pygmy. He was kidnapped from the Congo, and he was put in the Ringling Brothers Circus. Ada Benga, the pygmy people, hunter-gatherer, small, very jagged teeth. And they had him they likened him to a monkey, had him doing things like smoking cigarettes and stuff like that. This is all displayed at the human zoos. The reason why I bring that up, because all of that, when I talk about how information is propagandized, right? All of that was the propaganda created around the eugenics movement to say, look at this primitive, low-level fraction of a human being. He's not even really human. He's closer to monkey than he is to human. And the whole time this was a human being, right? Whole time this was a person kidnapped from his land, kidnapped from his way of life, kidnapped from his social order to be put on display in human zoos to perpetuate a pseudoscience and a propaganda to say that, look at these people, they are less than. This started hundreds of years ago. So the first domino that was knocked over that ultimately got us to the racial tension that we see, to the propaganda that we see present day, all of that started when America had a problem once it freed over 1 million enslaved Africans, enslaved indigenous people. They freed, and then they say, okay, we got a problem. Remember, I told you slavery was far too profitable a business model for them to ever abandon. So let's just repackage it as something different. So ever since then, when you go back to the antebellum era, when you go back to the start of the Ku Klux Klan, when you go back to a lot of the terrorism that happened on this soil against black people on this soil, a lot of it was rooted in the fear and ignorance that was being propagandized and perpetuated by the eugenics movement. You know who else is a son of eugenics? Bill Gates. And again, this is not an indictment of anything other than stating what the facts are. Margaret Sanger. You heard that reference with the Hillary Clinton campaign. That's when kind of that became public news. The whole idea of Planned Parenthood, that ideology, that thinking, 100% is in alignment with the eugenics movement. And so many other, it's more that unpack. So why am I talking about the psychology of racism? Because if we don't understand the pathology of behaviors or I should say, if we don't understand the mentality associated with the pathologies of behaviors that we see on display present day, then we are bound to have history repeat itself. Too often we focus our energy on the symptoms and we don't get to the root cause. So instead of talking about the what, I'd rather have an informational and educational conversation about the why, because that's going to be the thing that's going to help us to prevent it from being perpetuated wittingly or unwittingly. So now when you look at it through that lens and you understand the psychology of racism, why they think the way they think, you realize it's very difficult to make a rational or logical appeal to someone who's made it up in their mind that their existence is being threatened by mine. There's no way you can appeal to the rationale of someone who genuinely think my mere existence is threatening their existence. So you have to appeal to the emotion. You have to make an emotional requiem. You have to make an emotional appeal to the people. And in many ways, that was the philosophy behind Martin Luther King's approach during the civil rights movement. This idea of quote unquote being nonviolent wasn't at the surface. It's so many things that you could have conversations about. I don't agree philosophically and fundamentally with the idea of nonviolence, but I understand why such a position was taken. But the problem is, it's difficult to make an emotional appeal and a moral appeal to someone who's morally bankrupt. And in many ways, when you talk about the hatred that exists between minorities, specifically black people, there is no rationale whatsoever. There's no morality whatsoever. There's no humanity whatsoever. There's just an idea that says in order for me to survive, because I am of a recessive gene pool, I have to consolidate everything about my worldview to only dealing with us. And we cannot cohabitate, commingle with anybody. So because there's a case, there's already been scientific evidence to corroborate the Neanderthal gene being present in the Anglo-European. That again, not my evidence, not me. This is the world of science has already proven that there is a gene connection to the Neanderthal in the Eurocentric worldview, in the European. You know who has no Neanderthal gene? So why do I bring that up? Again, I'm trying to help everybody to understand the why. What would make somebody feel so threatened by the existence of another race that they feel like they got to wipe you out, that they feel they got to marginalize, that they feel they got to capitalize? This is the ignorance that has been perpetuated for so long. And if nobody is willing to put a mirror up so this level of ignorance can see itself for what it is, then we're going to keep getting the same thing over and over again. So There is a psychology behind why people who are racist feel threatened. People who are racist feel like every other race is the problem. But the reality is, history has given it. I don't listen to words. I don't care about titles or any of that. I watch the pathology of behaviors, because the behaviors will always tell the true mentality. The mouth can say anything. It could tell you a very comfortable, inconvenient lie and warm up to you and you'll believe it. I don't listen to words. I watch behaviors. In the pathology of behaviors, we have a history of death and destruction wherever there's been colonization. That's not my opinion. We have history to prove it. We have documented history to prove it. It's a book I encourage everybody to get. It's called They Came Before Columbus, right? There has been commerce going on between what was known as the Americas and Africa for centuries before Columbus or anybody else. That's why there's fruits and crops and vegetation that's indigenous to the eastern parts of South America that can be found on the western shores of Africa. That's why it's resources that's indigenous to the western shores of Africa that you can find in the eastern shores and throughout South America and what is known as America. There was always commerce taking place. There was always travel. There was always communication. There was always trade taking place between what's known as the Americas and what's known as Africa. Christopher Columbus and the Spanish conquistadors and all of those regimes made their way to what they call the New World. Centuries of commerce took place between African nations and what's known as the Americas. And not once did we ever bring smallpox blankets. Not once did we ever bring death. Not once did we ever bring destruction, because we could identify the humanity in one another. And we said, there's a way where you can thrive and I can thrive. And my thriving doesn't have to come at the expense of yours, and vice versa. What happened to the European? Valid question. I want to know genuinely, what will possess them to see? And you can read the excerpts directly from Christopher Columbus' his journal. They like, yo, he talking like these folk is so naive. You don't even have to buy land from them. They'll give it to you. And he took that as the liberty to say, let's take everything that they have and make this our land now. And let's kill all of them off since they're so naive. I'm only dealing with what the facts are. And this is a very hard truth and very hard reality to deal with. There was always commerce between what is known as the Americas and the indigenous people that live there, and what we know to be Africa and the indigenous people that live there. And not once did we ever bring slavery. Not once was there ever death or destruction. And business and lifestyle and ways of life was always traded amongst each other. So if we want to understand how we have the results that we have, if we want to understand why we see the things that we see on a social level, then I believe it's very important for us to understand what drives the behavior and ultimately what drives the mentality that makes racists feel the way they feel, to make those white people who align with those values feel the way they feel, to the point where they will vote against their own interests. The trees in the forest vote for the axe because it's handled made out of wood. I want to know the pathology of the behavior. And in learning that, I've realized there was some consistencies throughout, no matter where you look at the colonialism, European colonialism throughout the world. There was always a sense of normalcy, a sense of trade, a way of life and commerce that took place before the European colonized. And then the moment the European colonized, the only thing that followed was death and destruction. And then I'll leave on this note, and maybe we'll have this conversation at another time. I'll finish up this segment on this part. In order to understand the psychology of racism, you have to understand the pathology of behavior. I want everybody to Google what the Berlin Conference was. Look up the information on the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference is the most influential, impactful, and dangerous thing that happened to the continent of Africa in the last century. It set forth the colonialism that we see today. And when you have Burkina Faso, when you have Niger, when you have all of those countries in Africa fighting for their independence from underneath the colonial thumb, present day, all of that started with the Berlin Conference. And they divided up, the European nations came together and divided up Africa like pieces of pie.